The letter burned in Birdie Grady's hand like a coal pulled from a dying fire. She stood in the middle of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing July heat of 1882, her traveling trunk sitting crooked in the dust behind her, and she read the words for the third time as if repetition might somehow change what was written there. It did not change. It never would. Miss Grady, I regret to inform you that Mr. Elias Drummond passed from this world on the 14th of June, 2 weeks prior to your expected arrival. The land and holdings of Drummond Ranch have been seized by the First Territorial Bank of Caldwell to settle outstanding debts. There is nothing here for you. I am sorry for the trouble of your journey. Signed, Deputy Marshal Caleb Fry. Nothing here for you. Those 4 words landed like a fist to the sternum. Birdie had sold everything. Every single thing she owned in the world, which had not been much to begin with. But she had sold her mother's brooch, her father's pocket watch, her small apartment lease in Cincinnati, Ohio, and the dress shop position she had held for 3 years under a demanding woman, named Mrs. Elspeth Horn, who had never once said thank you. She had sold all of it to buy a train ticket west because Elias Drummond had written her 16 letters over the course of 8 months, letters full of promise and plan and the image of a life that felt like air after drowning. He was a rancher. He was 41 years old. He was not what Birdie would have called the love of her life, but he was stability, and stability was something Birdie Grady had never once known. And now Elias Drummond was in the ground, and the bank owned his land. And Birdie Grady was standing in the dust of Caldwell, Kansas, with $11.40 to her name, a trunk full of her remaining possessions, and absolutely no plan left standing. The betrayal of it was not even Elias' fault, and that somehow made it worse. There was no one to be furious at. There was no dark villain who had stolen her future. There was only the terrible, indifferent arithmetic of bad timing and worse luck. The man had died before she arrived. The debt had existed before he wrote to her, which gnawed at something deeper in her chest, something that whispered he had known the ranch was failing and had sought a wife as a kind of lifeline, which meant those 16 beautiful letters had been written by a desperate man rather than a hopeful one. She did not know if that was true. She did not know anything anymore. A horse passed close enough that she had to step back sharply, her boot heel catching on a loose board and nearly sending her down into the street. She grabbed her trunk for balance and stood there, breathing hard, the sun hammering her black traveling dress into something suffocating. This was the highest point of her undoing, and she had not even finished arriving. But let us go back, because the story of how Birdie Grady came west does not begin in Caldwell with a letter of bad news. It begins in Cincinnati, Ohio, 7 months earlier in the back room of Mrs. Horn's dress shop on a gray November afternoon, with Birdie Grady bent over a seam that refused to lie flat, and a decision pressing against the inside of her ribs like something alive. Birdie was 26 years old in November of 1881, which in Cincinnati polite society was already creeping toward the edge of what was charitably described as a late prospect for marriage. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense that women's magazines described, but she was striking in a way that had more to do with intention than feature. Her dark hair was thick and practical, always pinned with more urgency than artistry. Her eyes were a gray-brown that shifted depending on the light, and people who met her often found themselves uncertain whether her gaze was warm or measuring, because frequently it was both at once. She was 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with hands that were capable rather than delicate, because she had been working with those hands since she was 14. Her mother had died of a fever when Birdie was 16, and her father, Thomas Grady, a man of tremendous charm and disastrous financial judgment, had followed 2 years later, leaving behind enough debts to swallow any inheritance that might have cushioned his daughter's landing in the world. Birdie had landed hard and without cushion and had simply gotten up and walked forward, because there was no alternative she could see. She had worked her way from seamstress apprentice to a competent dressmaker, and she was good at it. Her eye for proportion was sharp, her stitches were precise, and she had a talent for understanding what a woman wanted her body to say when she walked into a room. But she made $11 a month at Mrs. Horne's shop, which was enough to eat and enough to rent her small set of rooms above a bootmaker on 4th Street, and not enough for anything else. Not enough for the kind of future that had its own name. The advertisement had appeared in the Cincinnati Enquirer in October of 1881, tucked between a notice for liver pills and a listing for unclaimed parcels at the post office. It was a modest advertisement. It did not make grand promises. It simply stated that Elias Drummond of Caldwell, Kansas, a widower of some years with a working cattle ranch of 1,400 acres, was seeking correspondence with a woman of practical disposition and honest character, with an eye toward matrimony if the arrangement proved agreeable to both parties. Birdie had read it 3 times, torn it out carefully, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. She had written to him that same evening. Her first letter to Elias Drummond had been careful and honest in a way that surprised even her as she wrote it. She had not embellished. She had told him exactly what she was, a working woman of modest means, no family, no inheritance, no great beauty by the standards of fashion magazines, but a willingness to work and an appetite for a life that was larger than the one she currently occupied. She had told him she was not romantic in the sentimental sense. She was practical. She wanted to know what the ranch needed from her before she wanted to know anything else, because she was not coming west to be rescued. She was coming west to build something. His first letter back had taken 3 weeks to arrive, and had made her laugh out loud in her small apartment for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. He wrote that he had received 42 letters in response to his advertisement, and that hers was the only one that had made him feel he was speaking to a real person rather than a character someone had assembled from the pages of a romantic novel. He was direct, almost blunt, with a dry humor that ran under his sentences like a current under still water. He told her the ranch was in working order. He told her Caldwell was rough but honest. He told her she would need to be neither delicate nor gentle to survive it, and he suspected from her letter that she was neither. They wrote back and forth through November and December and January and into the spring. 16 letters total, 8 from each of them, crossing and sometimes overlapping in the mail. Birdie had read them so many times the paper was starting to soften at the folds. She had made a plan. It was a good plan, she thought. She would arrive in late June. They would meet properly. They would discuss the arrangement with clear heads and honest expectations. If it suited them both, they would be married before the summer ended, and Birdie Grady would have, for the first time in her adult life, something that belonged to her. She had not allowed herself to expect love. She had read enough novels to know the difference between what people wrote about love and what love actually was when it showed up in ordinary life, which was mostly patient and inconvenient and built slowly out of the small material of daily habits. But she had expected something. She had expected at least the chance to find out. Elias Drummond had died of a heart failure on June 14, 1882, and taken that chance with him into the earth. Now Birdie stood in the July heat of Caldwell with the deputy marshal's letter in her hand, and tried to locate within herself some reserve of the practical disposition she had advertised so confidently to a dead man. She found it, eventually. It was buried under a very large quantity of devastation, but it was there. She folded the letter, tucked it into her bag, picked up her trunk by its handles, and walked toward the nearest building with a porch overhang that could shield her from the sun while she thought. The building turned out to be a saloon called the Sunrise House, which was not ideal, but the overhang was wide and the shade was genuine, and Birdie Grady sat down on her trunk and began the internal accounting that was, in difficult moments, her most reliable skill. Assets, $11.40. 1 trunk of clothing and personal effects. The skills of a trained seamstress and dressmaker. The ability to cook, garden, keep accounts, and negotiate with difficult women, which she had proven thoroughly at Mrs. Horne's shop. A return train ticket that was not yet purchased. Pride that could be set aside when necessary. Liabilities, no acquaintances in Caldwell, no position, no lodging, no future that she could currently name. The sun shifted slightly. Somewhere inside the Sunrise house, a piano started up, 3 notes and then a pause, as if the pianist were still deciding whether the day was worth the effort. Birdie decided it was. She stood up, straightened her dress, and went inside to ask if anyone in Caldwell needed a seamstress. The bartender of the Sunrise house was a wide, cheerful man named Hector Plum, who appeared to operate at roughly the same temperature in all weather conditions, which was to say warmly. He listened to Birdie's situation with his forearms resting on the bar and his expression moving between sympathy and the particular kind of appreciation men of business have for someone who gets directly to the point. "Drummond's girl," he said, not unkindly. "Heard you were coming, heard the news too. Sorry for it. That was bad luck on top of bad luck." "It was," Birdie agreed. "Do you know of anyone in town who needs sewing work, alterations, new garments, mending?" Hector Plum considered this. "There's a Chinaman on 3rd Street who does laundry but not sewing. There's a woman out on Ridge Road who used to do alterations but her eyesight went. I don't know that Caldwell's got a dedicated dressmaker at present. Is there a hotel I can afford for 3 nights on $11? Widow Fenwick takes boarders 2 streets over. $1 a night, meals included. She's difficult but clean." "Difficult doesn't trouble me," Birdie said. She took a room at Widow Fenwick's. It was small and smelled of cedar and something faintly medicinal, but the mattress was adequate and there was a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which was, Birdie decided, the minimum she required from any room she occupied. She spent the next 4 days walking every street in Caldwell and introducing herself. She called on the general store and offered to mend the owner's wife's dress that was splitting at the side seam, right there and then, for 50 cents. She called on the doctor's wife and altered 3 of her summer dresses that needed taking in. She approached the minister's household and repaired a set of curtains and 2 sets of boys' trousers for $1.20, and did it in an afternoon. By the end of the first week, she had made $4.15 and had established, in the particular way that small Western towns establish such things through rumor and observation, that she was reliable, skilled, and not going anywhere. The town of Caldwell in 1882 was a cow town in the truest sense of the phrase. The cattle drive still came through, though the peak years of the Kishom Trail were behind it. Thousands of longhorns moved through during the season, accompanied by trail crews who were rough and tired and spent their wages fast. The town had a complicated relationship with the cattle industry, being simultaneously dependent on it and periodically terrorized by it. There were saloons and dry goods stores and a land office, and a small newspaper called the Caldwell Post, and a church that was always in need of something. There was a marshal and 2 deputies, and enough of a civic establishment to give the impression of order even when order was largely theoretical. The surrounding land was big and mostly treeless, rolling grassland that went on until the horizon made a decision and stopped it. In the full blaze of July, it was the color of wheat straw and hammered gold, and the sky above it was so deeply, relentlessly blue that it seemed like something manufactured rather than natural. Birdie had grown up with Ohio's softer hills and tree cover and seasonal variability, and the sheer exposed scale of Kansas land did something to her interior geography that she was still working to name. It was not entirely comfortable. It was also not entirely unwelcome. She was sitting on Widow Fenwick's front porch on a Tuesday afternoon in her 2nd week, stitching a shirt collar for the general store owner's son, and listening to the sound of Caldwell doing its business, when she first heard Oliver Hartwell's name. It came from 2 men talking on the street below the porch, trail hands from the look of them, dusty and deliberate. "Hartwell's bringing his herd through Friday," one said. Hartwell or his foreman? Hartwell himself this time. They say he's checking the northern pasture situation personally. Something about a water dispute with the Crandall outfit. Water dispute with Crandall usually ends with somebody bleeding. Not with Hartwell. He takes it to the marshal first. Man's annoyingly law-abiding. The first man laughed at that. They moved on down the street. Birdie kept her eyes on her stitching but filed the name away in the mental ledger she kept of everyone in and around Caldwell who might eventually need something sewn. She did not think much more about Oliver Hartwell until Friday, when he rode into Caldwell at the head of a small remuda of horses, followed at a distance by a herd of about 300 longhorn cattle that filled the street's far end with noise and movement, and the particular smell of a working cattle drive, which was something that you either adapted to or spent your time in Caldwell permanently offended. Birdie was crossing the street near the feed store when the cattle started coming, and she had to press herself against the wall of the building and wait them out. She was not frightened of cattle. She was, however, practical enough to not stand in their path. She watched the herd move past and watched the riders working the flanks, and then she saw the man who must have been Hartwell riding slightly ahead and to the side, speaking to a broad-shouldered man who was clearly his foreman. Oliver Hartwell was 32 years old, which she would learn later. At this first moment she registered. A lean, straight-backed man in a dark hat with a jaw that looked like it had been decided upon firmly before birth and not revisited since. He was not handsome in the careful, considered way of Cincinnati parlor portraits. He was handsome in the way that the landscape around Caldwell was handsome, which was to say it was functional and clear-eyed, and did not particularly care whether you found it attractive. He wore the look of someone who spent his days solving problems before they became crises and who had built up, through long practice, a face that gave very little away. He was looking at the street, speaking to his foreman, and then his gaze swept across the front of the feed store and found Birdie standing there, pressed against the wall, holding her basket of sewing supplies with both hands to keep the jostling cattle from knocking it loose. He did not do anything dramatic. He did not tip his hat or make any gesture. He simply looked at her for a moment with those level gray eyes, as if he were assessing something and arriving at a preliminary conclusion, and then looked away to return to whatever he had been saying to his foreman. Birdie looked away too and told herself firmly that she was not in Caldwell to notice the color of Cattleman's eyes. She had a plan to rebuild. She was focused on the plan. The plan required her to build a client base, save enough to rent a small space for a proper workroom, establish herself as the town's dressmaker, and create from nothing a sustainable livelihood. It was a longer and harder plan than the one that had brought her west, but it was hers entirely, with no dead rancher's debt and no hidden motive in it, and that had a kind of cleanness she could respect even when she was exhausted from it. She met Oliver Hartwell properly 4 days later, and it happened in a way she could not have anticipated. She was at the general store, negotiating with the owner, a man named Gibbons, about the possibility of renting a corner of his back storage room for alterations and simple dressmaking work, when the door opened behind her, and she heard Gibbons straighten up and become approximately 30% more formal in his bearing. "Mr. Hartwell. Here for the supplies order. That and a question if you have a moment." Birdie stepped slightly to the side to allow the man to approach the counter and felt, rather than saw, him register her presence and file it for later attention. She was examining a bolt of cotton muslin and pretending to be very interested in it. "I'll be with you shortly," Gibbons said to Hartwell, and then returned to Birdie. "Miss Grady, I don't see how a corner of the storage room works for what you're describing." "It's not presentable." "I'm not concerned with presentable at the moment," Birdie said. "I'm concerned with functional. I need 4 walls, adequate light if you have a window, and enough floor space for a cutting table. I'm not asking for a shop front, Mr. Gibbons. I'm asking for a working space. The storage room doesn't have a window. Is there a window that could be put in?" That would be a structural modification to my building, Miss Grady, which I would pay for over time, as part of an arrangement that would bring women into your store with a regular reason to visit, which I suspect would not be bad for your other business." There was a pause. She heard, very quietly, a sound from somewhere to her left that might have been a man suppressing the beginning of a laugh. She turned her head. Oliver Hartwell was standing at a distance of about 5 feet, holding his hat in one hand and watching the negotiation with an expression that was carefully neutral but not entirely successful at hiding the fact that he found it interesting. "Miss Grady," Gibbons said, "I'll think on it. I'd appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Gibbons." She set the muslin bolt down and gathered her things. She turned fully to face the room and found herself looking at Oliver Hartwell at close range. He was taller than she had registered from across the street. There was dust on his coat from the road. His eyes were, she confirmed, gray, with the particular quality of gray that has absorbed a lot of sky and a lot of distance. "Miss Grady," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and had a slight western flatness to it that was not impolite. "I heard you were in town. I'm sorry about Drummond. That was an unfortunate situation." "It was," Birdie said, because there was nothing more to add to that and she saw no reason to perform distress for a stranger's benefit. "Oliver Hartwell," he said. "I know," she said. "You're the annoyingly law-abiding Cattleman." His expression shifted slightly, which on a face that practiced control the way his did was approximately the equivalent of open surprise on anyone else. "Where did you hear that?" "Two of your trail hands. They meant it respectfully, I think." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You don't have a workroom yet." "Not yet. My housekeeper has been saying for 2 years that she needs someone to come out to the ranch and deal with the domestic sewing situation. She describes it as a crisis, though she tends toward hyperbole. The point is there's genuine work out there if you want it. It's about 6 miles east. I can send a wagon." Birdie looked at him steadily. "That would be a day's work." "More likely 2 or 3. The housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, she is no relation to the town, will give you a specific accounting when you arrive. She's extremely specific." "What would you pay?" He named a figure. It was fair. It was, in fact, slightly more than fair, and she recognized immediately that he had made that calculation deliberately, which told her something about how he did business and how he thought about value. "I can come Wednesday," she said. "Wednesday works," he said. He put his hat back on and turned back to Gibbons's counter, and the conversation was over as cleanly and efficiently as it had begun. Birdie walked out of the general store and stood on the porch for a moment. She was not thinking about Oliver Hartwell's gray eyes. She was thinking about the money and the work, and the fact that this was how plans got rebuilt, one piece at a time. That was what she told herself. She arrived at Hartwell Ranch on Wednesday morning in a wagon driven by a young man named Pete who had very little to say and drove at a comfortable, steady pace that allowed Birdie to look at the land. It was, she found, impossible not to look at it. The grassland spread in every direction, and there was a particular quality to the morning light at that hour, and at that latitude that made the whole of it seem lit from within. The pale gold of the grass and the deep blue shadow under every low fold in the terrain, and the sky above it, all with a clarity that felt almost argumentative, as if it were making a point. Hartwell Ranch was visible from about a mile out. The main house was larger than she had expected, a solid 2-story frame building with a deep porch that wrapped around 3 sides, built from lumber that must have been freighted in at considerable cost, because there was no timber of that quality anywhere nearby. There were barns and outbuildings and a bunkhouse and several corrals that held horses, and further out along the slight rise of a natural slope there were cattle as far as she could sensibly see. Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, was a small, alert woman of about 50 who was exactly as specific as Oliver Hartwell had warned. She met Birdie at the wagon before it had fully stopped and had a list in her hand before Birdie was on the ground. 11 items, Mrs. Caldwell said. "I've been keeping the list since I heard you were coming. 3 sets of curtains that need rehemming, 2 shirts of Mr. Hartwell's that want mending at the cuffs and collar respectively, a table linen set that has gone at 4 of the corners, Pete's good vest that has a split seam, 2 work shirts belonging to the ranch hands that I've taken responsibility for because nobody else will, and 1 dress of my own that needs taking in at the waist since I've lost some weight this summer, which I'd appreciate you not mentioning to anyone because I don't need the commentary. Not a word, Birdie said. Good. Come in and I'll show you where you can set up. The workroom Mrs. Caldwell established for her was the front parlor, which had the best light in the house from a large east-facing window that opened onto the porch. There was a good table that Mrs. Caldwell cleared of its accumulated mail and paperwork with the brisk efficiency of someone who has been wanting to do this for some time. Birdie unpacked her kit, set out her thimbles and needles and thread, and went to work. Oliver Hartwell appeared at the parlor doorway at mid-morning, which she had not expected, given that she had assumed he would be out with the herd. He was still in his work clothes and carried a cup of coffee, and he stopped in the doorway as if he had not quite committed to the decision to come in. "Mrs. Caldwell feeding you?" he asked. "She gave me breakfast at 7 and said lunch would be at noon. She's reliable about meals." He looked at the arrangement she'd made of his parlor with the precise expression of someone who is deciding whether to be bothered by it. He was not bothered by it. She could tell. "How long will you need?" 2 days if the curtain hardware cooperates. Some of these hem weights are rusted. I'll tell Pete to get new ones from town. That would help. He came in then, which she had not quite expected, and sat down in the armchair that was furthest from her workspace as if he were being respectful of a boundary he had mapped out in his head. He looked at the shirt she was working on, which was his, one of the 2 with the cuff problem, and she had a moment of mild self-consciousness that she pushed aside because it was not useful. "Mrs. Caldwell says you're setting up as a dressmaker in town," he said. "I'm working on it." Gibbons is still deciding about the storage room. Gibbons decides slowly about everything. It's a calculated strategy. He thinks it makes people more eager. "Does it work?" "Not with me," he said. "But I'm not the population he's optimizing for." Birdie kept her eyes on the stitching. "You went to the marshal about the water dispute with Crandall." He looked at her with a slight narrowing of his eyes, not hostile, more like someone recalibrating a distance estimate. "You pay close attention. I hear things. Is it resolved?" "The marshal is mediating. Crandall's position isn't as strong as he thinks, legally speaking. He'll come around." He said this with the unconcerned certainty of someone who has done the calculation and found it sound. "And if he doesn't come around legally, then the marshal has authority and I have patience. Those 2 things together usually outlast whatever someone is trying to hold onto by force." He paused. "How long have you been alone?" The question was direct and might have been impertinent from someone else. From Oliver Hartwell it landed as something different, honest curiosity, the kind that has respect under it. "Since I was 18, Birdie said. "My father died, my mother before him. No other family. None that claimed the relationship when it would have cost them something." He was quiet for a moment, turning the coffee cup in his hands. "Drummond's letters, were they honest?" She looked up at that. "I think he believed what he wrote. I think he also knew more about the state of his finances than he let on, and I think loneliness makes people selectively truthful. I don't hold it against him. He's dead, and holding things against dead people is exhausting." Oliver Hartwell looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. "That's a reasonable position. I'm a reasonable woman. I'm beginning to notice that," he said. He left shortly after, and she sat with her stitching and the morning light and the quiet of the house, and tried not to think about how the conversation had felt, which was like talking to someone who was actually listening to what she said rather than waiting for her to stop so they could speak. She told herself firmly that she was here for the work. She returned on Thursday to finish. Mrs. Caldwell had prepared a running commentary on the household that served as both information and entertainment. And by Thursday afternoon Birdie had a working picture of Hartwell Ranch that she had not deliberately assembled, but found herself in possession of nonetheless. Oliver Hartwell had bought the ranch 9 years earlier with money from a cattle drive profit, and a bank loan that he had paid off in 4 years. He ran the operation clean and without the debt problems that sank other ranchers, including, it was implied gently, Elias Drummond. He had a younger sister in Wichita who visited twice a year and worried about him. He had a foreman named Dutch who had been with him since the beginning and who was universally agreed to be the most competent man on the property after Hartwell himself. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble. He read, which Mrs. Caldwell reported as a slightly eccentric quality in a cattle country, but he had 3 shelves of books in his study that were read, not decorative. He had been, 8 years ago, briefly engaged to a woman named Clara Fenchurch, who had come west with ambitions about frontier life that did not survive contact with the actual frontier, and who had returned to her family in St. Louis within the year. He had not, so far as Mrs. Caldwell knew, shown any serious romantic interest in anyone since, which Mrs. Caldwell described as a waste of a perfectly good man. Birdie listened to all of this with the expression of someone who was not particularly interested, which was, she was aware, not entirely accurate. She finished the work on Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Caldwell paid her from the household accounts and added, with an air of studied casualness, that she would very likely need Birdie to come out again in a month when the fall curtains needed to be sorted. Oliver Hartwell appeared as she was loading her kit back into the wagon Pete had brought around. He came from the direction of the corrals and was pulling on his coat against the early evening cooling, and he stopped at the edge of the porch. "Everything settled?" he asked. "Everything on the list," Birdie said. "I left the new hem weights with Mrs. Caldwell in case they're needed again." He nodded. He did not say anything else immediately, and in the space of that silence Birdie had the distinct sensation that he was working up to something and working against it simultaneously. "The Crandall situation is going to come to a head in the next few weeks," he said finally, which was not what she had expected. "Is it going to be dangerous?" "Not if I handle it correctly. But it will require my attention." He looked at her. "If Gibbons drags his feet on the storage room, the land office on 2nd Street has a back room they rent. The man there is named Alderman and he owes me a favor." Birdie looked at him for a moment. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I'm telling you it's an option." He said it plainly without the particular inflection men sometimes used when offering women assistance, the inflection that made the offer into a demonstration of superiority. It was just information. "Here is a thing that exists. Take it or leave it." "Thank you," she said. "I'll keep it in mind." She rode back to town with Pete and the evening light on the grass and her kit bag in her lap, and she allowed herself, for the length of the ride, to think about what it would be like to exist in a context where Oliver Hartwell's particular brand of practical consideration was a regular feature. She allowed herself that much. And then she got back to Widow Fenwick's and sat down to her accounts and put it away, because she had a plan to rebuild, and sentiment was a luxury she had not yet earned. The next 2 weeks moved quickly. She went to the land office on 2nd Street and spoke to a man named Alderman, who confirmed, with the slightly surprised expression of someone who had expected to be called upon for this favor but hadn't expected it so soon, that yes, there was a back room available, and yes, the rent was manageable, and yes, there was a window. It was a small window, but it faced north, which was actually the correct direction for sowing light, being steady rather than directional, which meant Birdie could work all day without the sun angle shifting her color judgments. She set up her workroom. She pinned a small hand-lettered card in Alderman's front window, BGRADY, dressmaking and alterations. She paid her first week's rent and went back to Widow Fenwick's and sat on the edge of her bed and felt something complicated that took a moment to identify. It was a feeling that had the shape of pride but was quieter and more private than pride usually presents. She had come west with a plan that had collapsed beneath her. She was building a new one from the materials at hand, and it was beginning to hold weight. That was something. It was, in fact, considerable. She was at her workroom cutting a length of calico on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after setting up when Oliver Hartwell knocked on the land office door and was directed to the back by Alderman. He knocked on her workroom door rather than opening it, which she noted. "Come in," she said, because she was elbow-deep in calico and couldn't easily cross the room. He came in. He had clearly come directly from the range. His coat was dusty, and he smelled of cattle and the particular clean outdoor smell of prairie grass and wind, and he carried his hat in his hand the way he always seemed to when he was in an enclosed space. "I wanted to tell you the Crandall situation is settled," he said. "The marshal's ruling came down. Crandall accepted it, which I'll admit surprised me slightly." "What changed his mind?" "The marshal's ruling was ironclad, legally speaking, and Crandall is many things, but he's not foolish enough to fight a battle he can't win in front of a court." Something moved across his face then, a slight easing of the controlled expression, as if the resolution of a problem he had been carrying had physically lightened something. "I wanted to tell you because you asked about it." Birdie set down her scissors. "Most people wouldn't have remembered that I asked." "I remember conversations," he said simply. She looked at him across the room, and the workroom felt very small, and the morning light was coming through the north window in its steady, honest way, and she became aware, clearly and without drama, that she was in a situation she had not planned for. "Oliver," she said, using his first name deliberately and watching him register it, "why are you here?" He looked at her for a moment. "I told you the Crandall ruling. You could have had any of your men bring that message. You came yourself. 6 miles in each direction. I'd like to know why." The controlled expression shifted again, this time further than she had seen it move before. He looked for a moment like a man who has been asked a question he has been avoiding asking himself. "Because," he said carefully, "I find that I think about your opinion of things, and I wanted to tell you myself." The room was very quiet. Outside, Caldwell went about its business. A wagon rattled past on the street. Someone was arguing good-naturedly about cattle prices 2 doors down. "That's honest," Birdie said. "I try to be." "I find that I think about your opinion of things too," she said. "I wasn't planning on it. I had a different plan. I know Drummond, not just Drummond. I came west with an entire architecture of what I was going to do and how I was going to do it, and all of it fell down. And since then, I've been building something smaller and more careful that belongs entirely to me. I wasn't planning to revise the structure." Oliver Hartwell came further into the room, not crowding but reducing the careful distance he usually maintained, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that had seen a lot of sky and a lot of open country and apparently retained the clarity of both. "I'm not asking you to give up what you're building," he said. "I wouldn't ask that." "Then what are you asking?" "I don't know exactly," he said, with the particular honesty of a man who prefers not to speak until he knows what he means and is making an exception. "I know that your workroom is small and your light is good, but your rent is adding up, and you are doing everything the hard way by choice because it's yours, and I respect that. I also know that there is a large house 6 miles east that has been running short of something for several years, and I have been unwilling to name the thing until recently." Birdie was quiet. "I'm not Drummond," he said. "I have no hidden debts. The ranch is in good standing. I'm not writing you letters to solve a financial problem. I'm standing in your workroom in my dirty coat because I couldn't think of a better way to tell you that I'd like the chance to know you better, and for you to know me, and to see if what I think might be true about us is actually true." "And what do you think might be true about us?" Birdie asked. He looked at her steadily. "That we make sense together." It was, she thought, possibly the least romantic declaration she had ever heard, and also, for reasons she could feel operating at some level below easy articulation, the most moving one, because it was exactly what she would have said if she had been the one to arrive at this point first. They made sense together. Not the breathless, catastrophic sense of the romantic novels, the deeper, more durable kind, the kind that could hold weight. "I need more time," she said. "That's fair," he said. "I'm not being coy, I'm being honest." "I know the difference," he said. "Take whatever time you need." He left. She stood in her workroom with the north light coming steadily through the window and her hands on the calico and her heart doing something that had no practical application but that she decided for once to simply allow. What followed was a courtship that had the character of the man conducting it, which was to say, unhurried, consistent, and notable for the complete absence of performance. Oliver Hartwell did not show up with flowers, though he did, once, leave a small parcel of books from his own shelves with Pete, who delivered them to Widow Fenwick's with the laconic message, "From Mr. Hartwell," and no further elaboration. He sent word when he would be in town and asked, very formally, if she might want to walk to the hotel dining room for supper, and when she said yes, he arrived on time and ate with her and talked to her about everything except what she privately wanted him to talk about, which was how he felt, because he was a man who showed things through behavior rather than declaration, and she was learning to read the language. She went out to the ranch again in August, and this time she stayed for 2 days at Mrs. Caldwell's particular invitation, sleeping in the guest room that had a window looking out over the south pasture and the endless Kansas sky. She sat with Oliver on the porch in the evenings after the day's work, and they talked, and the talking became the thing she looked forward to most about any given week. He had a mind that operated on the same frequency as hers in a way that she had never experienced before, the frequency of, here is a problem, here are the components of the problem, here is what I think about it, tell me where my thinking is wrong. He was not intimidated by being disagreed with. He seemed, in fact, to find it enjoyable. He told her about a book he had been reading on the economics of the cattle industry, and she argued with his interpretation of one of its central theses for 40 minutes on a Tuesday evening, and at the end of it he looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between rueful and illuminated and said, "You're right and I don't like it," which made her laugh so hard she had to put her hand over her mouth. She was falling in love with him. She was aware of it in the way that you are aware of the onset of a weather system, not the thunderclap, but the shift in atmospheric pressure that precedes it. The certainty that something is coming, that the air is loading with something that will change the quality of everything when it arrives. She was also afraid, not of Oliver specifically, but of the shape of the thing. She had come west with a plan that was really a form of self-protection disguised as pragmatism, a plan in which love was not the central feature because love, in her experience, was the thing that left you undefended when everything else went wrong. Her mother had loved her father, and that love had not protected either of them from his disastrous financial decisions. Elias Drummond had written letters full of something that might have been its beginning, and that had produced nothing but a dust-covered trunk beside the road and $11. One evening in early September, sitting on the porch with the last of the sunlight going orange and pink over the grass and the cattle moving in the far middle distance the way they always did at this hour, Oliver looked at her and said, "Tell me what you're afraid of." She looked at him. "That's direct. I've been watching you think about something for 3 weeks and I'd rather know than guess." She was quiet for a moment, then she told him. She told him about her father and her mother, and the pattern she had identified in her own life of loving being the precursor to loss. She told him about the 16 letters and the dead man and the dust beside the road. She told him that she had spent the years since her father died building a life that did not require anyone else as its structural support, because structural supports had a dark habit of failing, and that loving him frightened her not because she doubted him, but because she had built a very particular kind of armor, and she could feel it becoming insufficient. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things she most valued about him. When she finished, he said, "I can't promise you nothing will go wrong. I'd be lying if I said the ranch is proof against drought or disease or the general willingness of the world to surprise you badly. Those things are real. I know that. What I can tell you is that I'm not Drummond. I'm not writing you letters to solve a problem. I have no secrets here, no debts I'm concealing, no dark past I'm managing. What you see is the actual situation. The ranch is mine, clear. I'm a careful man." And I am asking you to let me be part of your life, not because it solves something for me, but because I want to be in it." He paused. "That's the best I can offer. Honesty and the intention to be worth trusting." Birdie looked at the orange sky and the grass and the cattle and the enormous, clear, indifferent sweep of the Kansas horizon, and she made a decision. "That's enough," she said. "That is actually enough." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her with that particular intention, and they sat on the porch as the sun went the rest of the way down, and the first stars came out above the grassland. And Birdie Grady felt something she had not felt since she was very young, which was the specific sensation of not bracing for what comes next. The courtship continued through September with the quality of something that both of them understood had already arrived at its conclusion, but was still completing the proper formalities. They went to Sunday service together twice. He brought his sister Emily to town during one of her visits and introduced them. And Emily Hartwell was 29 years old and had a warmth that was direct rather than performed, and who looked at her brother in Birdie's company with an expression of private satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal very thoroughly. One morning in late September, Oliver arrived at the land office with his hat in his hand and asked, in front of Alderman, who was pretending very hard to be absorbed in his paperwork, whether Birdie would do him the honor of considering his proposal of marriage. He made the proposal with the same quality he brought to everything, clear and honest and without theatrical decoration. And when she said yes, the only exterior sign he gave of what this meant to him was the slow unclenching of the breath he had apparently been holding. Alderman began clapping from behind his desk, and then appeared immediately embarrassed by the impulse but could not unclap, and Birdie laughed at this so genuinely that Oliver allowed himself a smile that was larger than she had yet seen on his face and which changed it considerably. They were married in October. The minister who performed the ceremony was the same one whose boy's trousers Birdie had mended in her first week in Caldwell, and he performed the ceremony with the warmth of someone who felt personally invested in the outcome. Mrs. Caldwell cried and denied it. Dutch, the foreman, stood in the back and looked at the ceiling at regular intervals in the manner of a man who was managing an emotion. Emily Hartwell, who had come back from Wichita for the occasion, stood at Birdie's side as witness and squeezed her hand during the vows with a grip that said welcome to the family more clearly than words. Oliver put a ring on Birdie's hand that had belonged to his grandmother, a plain gold band of a quality that spoke of genuine sentiment rather than display. And when he looked at her, as the minister spoke the final words, it was with the exact expression of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and has no intention of losing it. They rode to the ranch in the late afternoon, just the two of them, in Oliver's wagon with the rest of the world left temporarily behind, and the Kansas sky was doing what it did at that hour in October, which was to go every shade of fire and amber at once above the pale grass, and Birdie sat beside her husband and felt the warmth of his arm against hers, and thought that she had come west with a plan that had fallen entirely to pieces, and that what had grown in the rubble of that plan was better than anything the original plan had been capable of producing. She told him this. Better how? He asked with the slight smile that was becoming familiar to her, the one he kept under the surface of the more controlled expression, and which appeared when he was both pleased and trying not to be obvious about it. Because the original plan was about survival, she said. This is about something larger than surviving. What's it about? She looked at the fire-colored sky. Building something that's actually worth the building. He looked at the road ahead, and the smile settled into something quieter and more permanent. He reached over and took her hand the way he had on the porch that September evening, and they rode the rest of the way home in the particular comfortable silence of people who have run out of anything they need to prove to each other. The first winter at Hartwell Ranch was not easy. The winter of 1882 to 1883 in southern Kansas was a difficult one, cold snaps arriving earlier than expected, and the grass going short for the cattle before the worst of it hit. Oliver managed the herd with the steady competence that seemed to be his natural state, making decisions about the livestock with the focused calm of someone who has planned for this contingency and the next one. Birdie threw herself into the management of the house with an energy that surprised even her. She had been managing on her own for so long that the management of something larger felt less like a burden and more like a release. She kept the household accounts with the precision she had learned in 8 years of managing her own and found, inside a month, several places where small efficiencies could be achieved. She did not offer this information as criticism but as contribution, and Oliver received it as such. And the two of them together across the kitchen table with the ledger books open between them became a recurring feature of their evenings that they both, quietly, looked forward to. She continued her dressmaking work through the winter. She had kept her workroom at the land office and rode into town 3 days a week in weather that permitted it, and on the days it didn't, she worked at the large parlor table where she had first set up for Mrs. Caldwell's list. Her client base had grown to include most of the women in Caldwell who cared about their clothes, and several ranching wives who came from further out when they needed good work done. She was saving money. It was her own money, separate from the household accounts, and Oliver had never suggested it should be otherwise, which was, in the context of 1882 marriage law and social expectation, a more significant position than most men of his time would have held. She had raised it with him before the wedding directly, as she raised everything with him, and he had looked at her as if the question had not occurred to him to answer differently and said, "Your skills built that. It's yours." In the spring of 1883, when the grass came back thick and green after the hard winter, and the cattle were coming through their second season in better condition than expected, Birdie discovered she was pregnant. She told Oliver at breakfast because that was when they had the most time to talk, and she told him directly as she told him everything, and watched his face do the thing it did when he received information that mattered more than anything else he was currently attending to, which was to go very still. "How are you?" he asked before anything else. Not "how wonderful" or "I can't believe it" or any of the responses she might have expected. Just "how are you?" "I'm well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings. The doctor says it looks healthy." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He did not say much else immediately, but for the rest of the day he arranged his work so he was close to the house, which was not something he typically did, and in the evening he sat with her on the porch, and they talked about what they wanted for the child in the particular mixture of practicality and vulnerability that Birdie was learning was how they both handled the things that mattered most to them. The baby was born in December of 1883. It was a boy. They named him Thomas, after Birdie's father, which was Oliver's suggestion, offered quietly one evening in November when they were discussing the matter, and which undid something in Birdie's chest that she had not known was still knotted. Thomas Hartwell came into the world during a cold snap, delivered by the doctor from Caldwell, who made it out to the ranch with 40 minutes to spare. And he was from the beginning a child of forceful opinions and considerable lung capacity, which Mrs. Caldwell said reflected his mother, and which Oliver received with a smile that bordered on delighted. Birdie held her son in the winter-cold room with the lamp burning low and Oliver sitting beside her with his forearm warm against her shoulders, and she felt the completeness of the moment so clearly and so entirely that it seemed almost too large to hold. She thought about the dust-covered trunk beside the road in Caldwell in July, 17 months earlier. She thought about $11.40 and no plan left standing. She thought about how completely and utterly wrong she had been to think that was the end of anything. It had been the beginning. The years that followed were good years, layered with the specific texture of a life being actively lived rather than merely survived. Oliver expanded the northern section of the ranch by purchasing an adjacent parcel that had come available when an older rancher retired to live with his son in Colorado, and the additional acreage allowed them to increase the herd size without overgrazing. Birdie's dressmaking business grew to the point where, in 1885, she gave up the land office workroom and opened a proper shop on First Street, a small but respectable establishment with a proper front window and a sign that she had painted herself. She employed, from 1885 onward, a young Mexican woman named Rosa Delgado, whose family had come north from Texas, and who had excellent needle skills and a quick intelligence that Birdie recognized immediately. She paid Rosa fairly and trained her thoroughly, and Rosa was, within 2 years, capable of running the shop on the days Birdie was not in town, which happened with increasing frequency as the ranch and the children required her attention. Thomas was followed in 1886 by a daughter, Margaret, whom they called Maggie, who arrived in the spring with her father's gray eyes and her mother's expression of already being slightly skeptical of whatever was about to be said to her. And in 1888, a second son, James, who was from the outset a quiet, observant child who watched the world with the careful attention of someone who is taking notes for future reference. Oliver was, as a father, the man Birdie would have designed if she had been given the specifications and told to build one. He was consistent and present and honest with his children in the same way he was honest about everything else, which was to say completely and without condescension. He taught Thomas to ride by the time he was 5 and treated the lessons as a collaboration rather than an instruction, which meant Thomas had the particular confidence that comes from being trusted with genuine information rather than a simplified version of it. Birdie watched Oliver with the children and felt, on a recurring basis, the thing she had not allowed herself to expect when she wrote that first careful letter to Elias Drummond in the back room of Mrs. Horne's dress shop in Cincinnati. She felt loved, not in the breathless, catastrophic way of the novels. In the way that holds, the way that is present in the morning with the coffee and the ledger books and the baby on the shoulder and the ordinary decisions about cattle and curtains and rain, and is still present in the evenings on the porch with the sky going all its colors above the grass. She had not planned for this. That seemed, at this distance, like the most important thing she had ever failed to plan for. In the spring of 1889 there was trouble. A man named Vasquez, who worked for a large land company out of Kansas City, arrived in Caldwell with an offer to buy up significant parcels of the surrounding land for agricultural conversion. The cattle era was shifting. The fencing of the open range was underway across the territory, and the large land companies were buying what they could and converting grassland to farming operations, which was their legal right and their commercial calculation, and which was going to change the character of that stretch of Kansas significantly. Vasquez called on Oliver at the ranch with a polite and persistent offer that Oliver declined politely and without ambiguity. The offer was repeated twice more over the following month and declined twice more, and the third refusal was delivered with enough clarity that Vasquez understood the ranch was not for sale at any number he could offer, and he moved on to other properties. But the incident sharpened something for Birdie and Oliver both, the awareness that the world they had built existed in a larger context that was always in motion, that the land was not simply theirs because they had worked it, but was part of a landscape of competing interests and commercial pressures, and the relentless reshaping of the frontier into something more organized and less wild. They talked about it on the porch several evenings running, and the talking had its usual effect, which was to arrive at a position that belonged to both of them. They would hold the ranch. They would expand it carefully and build its legal standing in the new land registration systems that were coming. Oliver would serve on the county land board when the election came around, which he did, and Birdie would keep her shop running as a separate income that was not dependent on the cattle cycle, which she did. They would stay. They stayed. Oliver's sister Emily married a surveyor named William Cage in 1889 and settled in Caldwell, which delighted Birdie for reasons that were both selfish and genuine. Emily was, by this point, one of her closest friends, and having her 6 blocks away rather than 2 days' train ride in Wichita made the texture of daily life considerably richer. The two families ate together on Sunday evenings with a regularity that became one of the fixed points of the week, and the growing collection of children on both sides moved through the combined households with the comfortable familiarity of young people who have always known each other. Birdie's shop on First Street was, by 1890, an established fixture of Caldwell. Rosa Delgado had become her full partner in all but formal legal name, and in 1890 Birdie arranged, with Oliver's legal assistance and the firm's counsel, to make the partnership official and registered. Rosa was, by the time of this arrangement, 26 years old and running the technical side of the operation with a skill that had long since exceeded her original training. There were nights when Birdie sat at the desk in the room she had made her office at the ranch, the room that had been the old parlor where she had first set up Mrs. Caldwell's list of 11 items, and went over the accounts of both the shop and the household together, and the numbers told a story that she found, on a recurring basis, almost implausibly good. She had arrived in Caldwell in July of 1882 with $11.40 and a plan that had collapsed. By 1890, she had a husband and 3 children and a ranch that was in excellent order and a business with a registered partner, and enough in savings to weather 2 bad years without significant hardship. She had built it. She had built it herself, with the partnership of a man who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was, and that qualification mattered enormously to her, the more she understood what it meant. She told him this one evening in the fall of 1890, sitting on the porch that she had loved from the first time she saw it. The children were inside. Mrs. Caldwell, who had been persuaded out of retirement twice to help with the children's early years, and who had finally retired properly the previous spring, was now living in a small house in Caldwell that Oliver had helped her purchase. The evening was cool, and the grass was the deep tawny color it went in the fall, and the sky was doing its thing. "I think about who I was when I arrived here," Birdie said. "The woman standing in the dust with the trunk and the letter. What do you think about her?" Oliver asked. That she was braver than she knew. She had lost everything, and she immediately started building. She didn't wait to be rescued. He looked at her. "She wasn't rescued," he said simply. "She built what she needed. I was fortunate enough to be a material she wanted to work with." Birdie looked at him and felt the particular warmth that was specific to this man who had never in 8 years of marriage taken credit for anything that was hers to own. "Oliver," she said, "I love you in a way that I couldn't have planned for. I want you to know that. Not the practical sense, not the arrangement, the actual thing, the whole of it." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that had not changed, that were still exactly what they had been in Gibbons's general store on that August morning, level and clear and honest and seeing her completely. "I know," he said. "I've known for a long time." He reached out and took her hand as he always did, as he had done on the porch in September of 1882 when the stars first came out above the grassland. "It's the same thing I feel, the whole of it." They sat together in the fall evening, and the grass moved in the wind, and the sky went dark above the ranch that was theirs, and Birdie Grady Hartwell thought about plans. The ones that had failed and the one that had grown in their place, and the absolute impossibility of knowing, when you are standing in the dust with your trunk and your $11 and your destroyed future, that the wreckage you are standing in is the particular shape of ground that something better requires. She had come west with a plan that fell apart, and she had found in the ruins of it a cattleman with a better one. Not a plan for what she should be, or what she should need, or what shape her life should take. A better plan in the simplest possible sense. To be honest, to pay attention, to make space, to stay. That was what Oliver Hartwell had offered her. Honesty and the intention to be worth trusting. And he had kept that offer, every day, in every small and significant way, for 8 years and counting. She was going to hold on to it for every year that followed. In 1891, Caldwell continued to change. The cattle drives through town had slowed considerably as the railroad pushed further west and ranchers began shipping their cattle by rail rather than driving them up the trail. The character of the town was shifting from a rough cattle trading post toward something more settled and civic-minded, and the shift brought new families and new businesses and a different kind of pressure on the land. Oliver had anticipated this. It was one of the qualities Birdie most valued in him, the ability to see the direction of things a year or two before they arrived. He had begun diversifying the ranch operation, adding a grain crop on the southern section where the soil was richer, and working with two neighboring ranchers on a cooperative arrangement for water access that made all three operations more stable. He was practical and forward-looking in equal measure, and watching him work was, for Birdie, one of the quiet, ongoing pleasures of her life. Thomas, now 7, was beginning to show an aptitude for numbers that delighted Oliver, and which Birdie recognized with a slight smile as her own contribution to the family genome, expressed in her son's serious attention to the accounts when he was allowed to sit beside his father at the desk. Maggie was 5, and had already made very clear that she intended to be involved in everything on the ranch at all times, an intention that nobody had succeeded in moderating. James, at 3, was still mostly observing, but with an intensity that suggested he was storing significant amounts of information for future application. Oliver watched his children and loved them with the same quality he brought to everything: steady, honest, and fully present. One evening in September of 1891, Birdie and Oliver sat together after the children were in bed, in the kitchen with the lamp burning and the ledger books open but not currently being attended to, and Oliver looked at her with the expression he wore when he had been turning something over for a while and was ready to say it. "I want to add to the north pasture," he said. "There's a section that the Rafter K has been trying to sell for 2 years. The price is reasonable and the water access is good. What does the overall debt picture look like if we do? Clean. I wouldn't take it on if it required borrowing. I have enough in the capital account." "Then do it," she said. He looked at her. "I wanted to discuss it with you. I know. I'm telling you my position after discussion. Do it. The ranch should grow while there's good land available and you can do it clean." He smiled. That smile that was larger than he usually allowed and that she had never gotten over, not once in 8 years. The way it opened his face into something that was completely without the control he exercised everywhere else. Something that was simply, completely glad. "All right," he said. "Oliver." "Yes." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, reversing the direction of that first gesture on the porch, which felt right. "I'm happy. I want you to know that. I'm genuinely, specifically happy." He looked at her hand on his. "So am I," he said. Every day, they were, that was the thing. Not in spite of the hard beginning, but somehow inclusive of it. Because Birdie had not been rescued from her circumstances, but had walked through them into something she had helped build with her own capable hands and her own clear eyes, and the partnership of a man who had looked at her in Gibbons's store, and decided she was worth the 6 miles in each direction. Rosa Delgado ran the shop on Thursdays and Fridays now with complete autonomy, and Birdie spent those days at the ranch and at the county council meetings where she had, through the accumulated weight of being present and informed and unwilling to be dismissed, become a recognized voice on matters of civic concern. She was not elected to anything. Women in Kansas in 1891 could vote in school board elections but not general elections, which Birdie considered a manifest injustice that she said so clearly and often. But she was present, and she was heard, and she was building something in that space too, incrementally, the way she built everything. In the winter of 1892, a 4th child arrived. Another boy, whom they named Charles, after Oliver's father, and who was, from his earliest weeks, a sunny-natured child of remarkable equanimity, who seemed to have inherited some combination of Birdie's practicality and Oliver's steadiness, and applied both to the business of being an infant with what Mrs. Caldwell, who came out to see the baby, described as admirable efficiency. Birdie held Charles on the winter porch one afternoon in February, wrapped in a good wool blanket, the baby asleep against her shoulder, and looked out over the ranch. The cattle were visible in the middle distance, standing in the cold with the patient endurance of cattle everywhere. The grass was pale and dormant. The sky was the flat white-gray of a Kansas winter afternoon, and there was a thin line of blue along the far western horizon that suggested the weather might break tomorrow. Oliver came out and stood beside her, and she leaned slightly into the warmth of him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, careful of the baby. "The water in the north section is freezing," he said. "Pete knows what to do about it." "He does." He looked out at the land. "This is mine," he said, and she knew he did not mean the ranch. He meant this: the porch and the woman beside him and the baby and the pale winter grass and the blue line on the horizon. "Ours," she corrected very quietly. He tightened his arm around her shoulders. "Ours," he agreed. She had come west with a plan that fell apart. She had stood in the dust of Caldwell in July heat with $11.40 and a letter that said "Nothing here for you," and she had decided, with the practical disposition she had advertised to a dead man, that this was not the end. It had not been the end. It had been, in all the ways that mattered, the most important beginning. The baby stirred against her shoulder and settled again, and the blue line on the horizon widened slightly, and the long Kansas evening came in from the west with all its colors, and Birdie Grady Hartwell stood on her porch beside her husband and felt the full, warm, specific weight of everything she had built, not salvaged from disaster, not settled for, but built deliberately and well from the rubble of a fallen plan. With her own two capable hands and the partnership of a man who had understood from early on that what she needed was not rescue but space, and who had given her that space without reservation or condition, and who was still, in the gray-eyed, steady, slightly smiling way. That was entirely his own, giving it to her now. She turned and looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything else. Nothing else needed to be said. The light changed on the grass and the ranch was quiet and they were home.